Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Yachi Play. My name is Sani Fakhouri, and... Jad? Jad? Oh well, I guess it's just me today. With Jad seemingly having disappeared, I was going to do a personal favorite of mine, Twilight Struggle. All right. If you haven't heard of this game, this is like top 3 on Board Game Geek for a reason. It is an excellent 2-player game of tension and struggle, and it's just one of the most beautifully thematic games I've ever had the pleasure of playing. We recently had a tournament here in Dubai for Twilight Struggle, and I was very fortunate enough to get first place, hence the little medal I'm wearing here. And I want to show you how you can get your own medal when playing this game of Twilight Struggle. This video is intended for new players who have only played the game maybe once or twice, or maybe even no times at all. I won't be going through rules, but I'll be focusing more on strategy and what you can do to try to beat your, no doubt, more experienced opponent, right? I mean, if you're playing this for the first time, you probably have a friend of yours trying to encourage you to play this game, and he will certainly have a leg up on you for sure. So with that, let's go over some basics of what the game is about. This game is a wonderful mix of a card-based game where players will have certain cards in their hand that they will hold in their hand, and they'll be playing action round to action round. And it's also a bit of area control. And by bit, I mean a lot. So you'll notice the game board here is split up into different continents representing the Cold War, the struggle between the US and the USSR. And you have different continents like Central America, South America, Europe, which is split into Western and Eastern, Africa, the Middle East, and then Asia with the subcontinent of South Asia over here. And throughout this game, it's going to be a back and forward between the US and USSR as they try to vie for dominance over these regions. So that's going to be a very basic overview, but there's also many more things going on. There is a DEFCON meter that you have to worry about because if this thing gets to 1, a player might actually lose. There's a victory point track that keeps track of how many points the players have accrued. If any player gets to 20, they win the game automatically. There's a space race, which is a little side thing that goes on where you can try to throw away bad cards in your hand, and many, many more things. I could be here all day explaining all these things, but let's just jump straight into what things you need to consider when playing this game. And I'm going to start with the first thing. Yes, there are many ways the game can end, but the biggest one that new players have difficulty with is victory points. If your opponent knows what he's doing, he can quickly clock you out on getting maximum victory points by controlling the regions he needs to control and getting those scoring cards out, and the game can usually end before turn 3, and you're just sitting there going, what the heck happened? I thought this was supposed to be a long game. I see there's 10 turns over here. How did this come to be? On that note, I think the biggest thing to start with is the understanding of scoring. Okay, so every single region in this game has a scoring card that comes out, and these regions can be scored more than once, so it is in your interest to invest in them. In the early war, you get these 3 regions over here. You get Europe scoring, Asia scoring, and Middle East scoring, which is basically known as the early war continents over here. And this will be the focus of most players early on, where they fight for control of these places. However, once you get to the mid-war, which happens around turn 4, that's when you kick in the other scoring regions, which become the other continents of the game: Central America, South America, Africa scoring, as well as Southeast Asia scoring, although this will only happen once in the game. So that's really the first thing. Many players typically are not sure where they should go. The fact that the deck gives you these 3 continents early on means that you should be focusing on these 3 regions towards the start of the game, and transition, if you make it far enough, to these ones once you get to around round 3 and round 4. Okay, you should understand carefully what it means to score a region, okay? I know that when many players are taught this game, they're given a little sheet over here that shows the round summary, as you can see over here, and it's like, okay, presence, that's easy. Control, have more countries in all battleground, domination, and it can get quite confusing quite quickly. So I'm going to try to talk about what you need to know. Presence is the easiest one to score. It basically means you are in a single country. Doesn't matter which one it is, doesn't matter if it's battleground, doesn't matter if it's non-battleground. You just have to have one single territory under your control. For example, at the start of the game, if you look at the Middle East, nobody controls any countries in the Middle East, so it doesn't count for anybody, right? Nobody has presence there. However, controlling one single country gives you presence, okay? And this sounds, you know, dumb, like, duh, you're gonna get one country, right? But I've seen situations where the US player is completely knocked out of the Middle East, and they lose out on getting 3 points because they have no countries there, which is very, very rough. We'll be talking about early game strategies in a bit, but there will be ways to combat against that happening to you. I think the next easy thing to explain is control. And control just sounds very like all-encompassing. And everyone is tempted by the control victory condition of Europe. If you can control Europe, you win the game immediately. Wow, that sounds amazing. I want to go for it, right? Although, hold your horses, it is quite difficult to get there. Two things to consider. Number one, to have control, you must control all the battleground countries in that region. That is all the countries with the dark blue region. Like if you want to control Europe, for example, you'd have to have Poland, East Germany, West Germany, France, as well as Italy. And not only that, you must control all the battleground countries and have more countries than your opponent. Okay? And this is quite important because maybe your opponent is winning and getting the control in a region. However, if you can actually beat out on him in total countries, you can deny him that control victory, right? So it's kind of hard in some regions, but for example, if things are looking dire in, say, Africa, for example, where there's 5 battleground regions here, maybe you just spread out and control all but all battleground countries and deny him that control scoring from him. The last one is domination. And this is where things get quite tricky because with domination, you have to meet 3 different conditions. Number 1, have more battleground countries than your opponent. Number 2, have more countries than your opponent. And then number 3, have at least 1 non-battleground country. And many players typically forget that third rule of having a non-battleground country. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose the games are going on and the Middle East is being taken left and right. So, you know, maybe Iran and Israel belongs to the United States. And the Soviet player has been playing kind of hard into Iraq as well as Egypt. So presently, it looks like a tie, but let's suppose they were able to control Libya as well. You look at this and you're going, wow, looks like the USSR is doing really well. They have themselves 3 countries to the US's 2 countries, right? And you're thinking, oh, they surely have domination, right? But remember, they have to have at least 1 non-battleground country as well. And as it stands right now, they don't have that. So if we were to do scoring of this region, the USSR would only be winning by 1 point because they have 1 more battleground instead of 3 points, which doesn't sound significant, but 2 points is a lot in this game. That's 10% towards your condition of winning the game. So be mindful of that, all right? One other thing people don't recognize is the non-battleground condition is present for domination, but it's not there for control. And this typically comes up when you're fighting over South America, which I'll be getting into later. But let's suppose the US has had a good time and they've been able to take all of South America over here. So there's 2 here, and then 3 over here, right? They have complete control over this region, and they do not need any non-battleground countries to do so, okay? I've had this question come a lot in the games I've played, and yeah, the US now has 10 points sitting on South America, and that can be game-ending unless the Soviet Union can do something about it. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Make sure you understand scoring and make sure you understand the intricacies of there, okay? So whenever you're given the scoring chart, take some time to read this. And of course, if you're playing with a good opponent, you should always ask, hey, quick scoring count on Middle East, what's going on here? I know it can be telling if you say that because you're thinking, oh, you must have the Middle East scoring card, but better that you know than playing the card and your opponent saying, oh, you don't have the non-battleground country? My bad, you only get 1 point. And that can be really, really soul-crushing for a game like this. Okay, so so there's a lot of topics to talk about. I think the next thing we can talk about is turn 0. Turn 0 is the initial setup before the game begins. So as the person you're playing the game with will tell you, you basically have to decide where you want to place your starting influence, both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe for the Soviet player before the game starts. Now, you are allowed to look at your opening hand before you decide. And that's a really good idea because there will be some recommendations based on what your opening hand is, although that's really only for the US player, okay? For the Soviet player, your opening is 6 influence in Eastern Europe, and you should almost never deviate from this opening position, which is spending 4 of your 6 influence in Poland, spending 1 of the 6, so all 5 of the 6, into Eastern Germany to bring it up to a 4, and then finally 1 extra point into Yugoslavia, okay? And the reason why this is a good Soviet setup is because it helps combat against certain cards. It helps to over-control the 2 battlegrounds that the Soviet Union has started, and as we've seen, battlegrounds are important in this game. It also defends against the card East European Unrest, because if the US player were to play that at the beginning of the game, he could potentially knock out East Germany and Poland, meaning you lose control, and then play a sneaky Europe scoring card and get away with that. The 1 point Yugoslavia is very good because it connects to both Greece and Italy. And as we'll see when we talk about scoring, Greece and Turkey and Spain, Portugal are very valuable non-battleground countries in the fight for Europe. For the United States, the US typically has 2 typical openings, and it depends on if they have this card in their hand, and that is the Marshall Plan. If the US does not have Marshall Plan in their hand, their best opening is to place 4 influence in Western Germany and then 3 influence in Italy. And this does a couple of things. Number 1, it gives them the Western Germany battleground. And number 2, it overprotects Italy from any shenanigans on their part. If they think about trying to coup Italy, it'll be a bit more defended against that. Yeah. Something you should be aware of is you should not place influence early on in France because there are quite a few cards in the early war deck that takes influence away from France. So leaving it empty minimizes the impact of those cards, right? So that takes care of that opening start without the Marshall Plan card. If, however, you do have the Marshall Plan card, that's great because this lets you spread even more influence out into Western Germany. Instead, your opening should be something like this. You put 3 influence in Western Germany, you put 2 influence in Italy, and that leaves you with 2 more influence, which you will then place 1 and 1 into Greece and Turkey. And the reason why this is a better play is because of Marshall Plan, you can play this in the headline phase and then basically take control of a whole bunch of countries. Basically, you can take Turkey, Greece, Italy, and West Germany, as well as effectively either secure domination in Europe or stop the Soviets from being able to dominate Europe for effectively the rest of the game. So that is nice. You start with that. If you don't, you gotta stick with the basic opening I showed you from before. So that is turn 0. I know some people on the internet like to talk about the Soviet Comic-Con trap, where they basically try to surround Western Germany and then try to realign them out. However, typically the first play of the USSR is to go for a coup in Iran, and that, if you're realigning in Europe, you're allowing the US to spread from there, which is no me gusta. So don't do that at all. All right, let's set things up for a typical game. Let's assume that the US did not get Marshall Plan. Let's see what would happen following that. So that's basically the start of turn 0 and what you can do there. All right, so let's talk about general strategic considerations. So because Twilight Struggle is a big game about all these cards, it can feel daunting to play this game and not know all the cards in the deck. That's okay. You don't actually need to know all the cards in the deck to begin playing this game, although there's a few you want to be aware of, which I'll talk about in a bit. What you should be thinking about, though, is just general thoughts about strategy in the game. So at the start of the game, you're going to be dealt 8 cards into your hand. So let's just suppose I shuffled this up and I gave 8 cards to the Soviet Union, and let's suppose I was playing as the US, for example. So 8 cards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And here is a supposed example hand for the US player. So the thing to keep in mind is that in this game, cards can be used for 2 different purposes. You can either use it for the event, which is the text of the card, or you can use it for the operation points, which is the value up here at the top left. If you're ever in doubt as to what to do with a card, a good rule of thumb is to just play it for the points. Because early on, this game is all about board control, and it's all about getting points and spending points as you get them, okay? So, you know, you can see there's quite a few options here for cards. There's quite a few Soviet cards in this particular hand, so not so great. But when you play a card on your turn, you then decide if you want to do it for the event or operations. Let's suppose in this case you decide to play this card. You have 2 points. What can you do with those operations? Well, you can either place influence, realign, do a coup d'etat, or launch it into space. These are your 4 main options. Early on, you pretty much want to be exclusively placing influence, although there's exceptions to that. And placing influence basically allows you to spread out onto the board and get points down, okay? If there is ever a doubt as to what you should be doing, putting influence down is almost always a fine thing to do, okay? That's just some good beginner advice there, okay? When you draw your hand, you should take a look at all the cards in your hand and note the ones that are belonging to your opponent, all right? In this game, there are cards that, if you look at the main name here, you can see either there is a asterisk or there would not be an asterisk, right, like in this case. Or there's some that will actually have an underlined text like this. Basically, cards that have an asterisk are one time only. When they're played, they're removed from the deck, never to be seen again. On the other hand, those that don't have an asterisk are considered to be continuous. They'll keep coming back, and they will keep doing what they do as the deck is reshuffled. So you want to keep this in mind. A card that belongs to your opponent looks daunting, but if you're the player who has the card, you can trigger it at an optimal time, usually when this card will do the least amount of damage to your side. So this is good. Honestly, there's a good rule of thumb with this game, which is many times new players look at a hand like this and they say, oh, look at all these cards belonging to my opponent. This is going to be a bad turn. Once you get more experienced, it kind of flips around and you go, oh, I have all these cards that my opponent's supposed to have. Oh, this is going to be a good turn. Because you know that you can control the effect of these, and you know your opponent won't be surprising you with these cards. So take advantage of that. Okay, so that is just the basics. Placing influence down, usually a good thing to do if you're not sure what to do with a card. Try not to trigger too many events, although there's a few we should talk about. And finally, try to figure out a good way to trigger these bad cards during your turn. And try to trigger the ones that have the asterisk so you don't have to worry about them later on. Okay, reshuffle. We need to talk about this. So, in a typical game of Twilight Struggle, you will have 2 to 3 reshuffles of the deck, which occurs on turn 3, and also somewhere around turn 6 and 7, and occasionally also on turn 10. Although if the game lasts that long, then it's a completely different story. The turn 3 reshuffle is probably the most important reshuffle of the game, because if you play any cards in turn 1 and turn 2, those cards will be coming back in turn 3. However, if you're able to hold on to cards until after turn 3, then those cards will be gone and will not return until at least round 6 or round 7. And this is very important because in the early game, there are a couple of very devastating cards that you need to be worried about. So I'm going to show a couple of these for both players. Let's suppose you're playing as the US. These 2 cards are the ones you need to be worrying about. And honestly, for the USSR, there aren't that many crazy things. I would argue that maybe, where is it? Yeah, defectors. That's probably the one that you'd want to look out for, although it's not that awful. So if you're the US player, these 2 cards are probably the most devastating in the game. You have decolonization and you have destalinization, okay? And if you ever get these cards in your hand, you must try not to play them. Actually, don't even try, just don't play them at all, all right? Throw them in the space if you have to, but these are just terrible because decolonization allows the USSR player to basically take control of Africa and Southeast Asia. And because this is an area control game, just handing this to him will be GG in those regions. Desalinization, on the other hand, allows the Soviet player to spread out into other regions that are not easily controlled, and an early play of this can also be pretty bad. For the USSR, Defectors is not a bad card to worry about, but if you can actually get rid of it in turn 3, that's great because you won't have to worry about your headline being cancelled and you can play headline safely. So, what does this mean for the US? Let's suppose you're playing the game and it's turn 1 and you have one of these 2 cards in your hand, okay? Not great. I mentioned you shouldn't be playing them, so what do? Basically, your objective is to hold onto this card for 2 rounds, okay? So you're going to hold it for round 1, not play it, then hold it for round 2, not play it, and then in round 3, you can safely throw it away. Because by that time, the deck would have reshuffled, this card would be gone, and you will not be seeing it again for quite a while. Typically, by the time this comes back, if you do this, it'll be too late for it to be effective because hopefully Southeast Asia and Africa would have been controlled by that time. All right, so these are the cards you should be watching out for and trying to hold on into round 3, okay? What can we talk about next? So I think we can talk about early game objectives, right? So, okay, you've played your headline cards. You didn't have the U.S. didn't have the Marshall Plan. The USSR didn't do anything crazy. It's an open board. What do? So we'll first talk to the USSR player and tell him what he should be doing. Now, the USSR will always have the first action round of each game, and it has been argued amongst the community as to what's the first best move. Some people say you should be coupping Italy. Some say you should be coupping Iran. I am personally in the camp of coupping Iran. That is typically a very good first turn play because it does 2 things. Number 1, it knocks the US out of a critical battleground state in the Middle East. And number 2, it denies them access to Pakistan and therefore India. This blocks the US out of 2 critical Asia battlegrounds, and that can be very effective at trying to secure the rest of Asia. Because if you look at the board carefully, if the US can get to Pakistan and India, they can also quite easily get to South Korea and Japan, and then they would have the 4 battlegrounds in Asia to have domination. So doing a coup in Iran is great. My recommendation is you play a card of a value of 3 or 4, typically one whose event you don't really care about. I mean, if you have desalination, don't play it for this purpose. And then do a coup in Iran, and that will be usually a very good first play. You might be tempted to use the China card. However, I would argue that it's better used in Asia because you can use it to spread out more efficiently if the US doesn't fight back. But yeah, let's just suppose that was the case. So let's say that the USSR played, I don't know, let's suppose they played Warsaw Pact Union, and they said, okay, I'm doing a coup in Iran. They roll the dice, and they get this amount, 7 to its 4. Basically, Iran is knocked out, and the USSR goes up to 2. The DEFCON goes down. They get 2 military ops, and looks pretty good. So what does the US player do? Well, the US player basically can do one of 2 things, and it depends on how well the coup in Iran went. Did it go really well? Is the USSR solidly in control of Iran? If they are, it might be good to focus your priorities elsewhere and just give up Pakistan and India. If, however, the coup was not amazing, let's suppose it was only a 1, you might be right to counter-coup and try to take back Iran, and if you do so solidly, it might discourage the USSR from trying it again, and they might focus their attention elsewhere. But let's suppose it was a pretty good coup, as we saw. What can the US try to do? Well, the US in the early game has 4 priorities, and the order of these really depend on what kind of scoring cards you have. Like, for example, if the US has Middle East scoring, maybe they want to focus on the Middle East objectives, or if they have Europe scoring, maybe they'll go for the Europe's objectives, okay? These are the objectives of the US in the early game. The US should try to grab Lebanon and Egypt. I'm not just saying this because I'm Lebanon, but because Lebanon is actually a very good country for the US. It's very easy to control. It only costs 1 point. And even though it's easily couped by the USSR, it's going to be wasting them some time. And very important is later on in the game, there is a card called Muslim Revolutions, which will come up. And that can basically wipe out influence from the Middle East for the US. However, a critical country not on this list is Lebanon. Lebanon is safe from this attack, so taking it is a nice, easy early game score. If the US is completely knocked out of the Middle East, Lebanon is just a very nice place to be. when you want to put points in Egypt, you want to put at least 2. Because if you only put in 1, along can come Nasser and basically knock out your influence and have have the USSR take control of Egypt. So you want to put at least 2 there. So maybe the US will play a 3-point card and take both Egypt and then Lebanon, right? So that's the Middle Eastern objectives that you'd want to do early on. Okay, so those are the Middle Eastern objectives. There's other objectives as well. If Middle East is not the priority, you can instead focus on Europe, okay? For the US and Europe, they want to take control of the 2 stability non-battleground countries, which are Greece, Turkey, and Spain, Portugal. And the reason why that is because you want more countries at the end of the day, right? Do you want to spend 4 influence to take Austria and have 1 country? Or do you want to spend 4 influence to take 2 countries? I think the answer is clear, right? You want more countries. So Greece, Turkey, and Spain and Portugal are typically fought over because of how easy they are to control. And yes, they're susceptible to coups, but once the DEFCON drops to 2, that's almost never going to happen. So you could spend some cards to try to control Greece, and then maybe typically go for Greece first because the USSR can access it, but Spain, Portugal is kind of safe because it's kind of far away from them. They'd have to spread out to West Germany and then France, and then finally Spain, Portugal to take control of it. So I typically leave that for last. You could take Greece and then maybe on a future turn take Turkey. The next objective is to do with Asia, right? So here's the Asia map, and what can the US do here? Well, a couple of things. A very good move is to spend 1 of your influence points. Let's suppose you played a 4-op card. You could take both Lebanon and Egypt, and then maybe just place 1 influence in Malaysia. Okay? And this basically threatens the US player with moving into Thailand in the next turn. So pretty good turn to threaten over there. Common mistake US players make is that they spend their influence points to take control of South Korea or Japan. And this is kind of a waste because for Japan, there's a card that'll do it for you automatically, which is, where is it? It's the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact. And also South Korea is a risk because there is the North-South Korean War, which could possibly lose you those precious points, the Korean War. And if you're not careful and you put too many points in, that could lose you control of that. Finally, if the USSR flubbed the coup in Iran, you should totally spread out into Afghanistan and Pakistan. Although Pakistan's a bit worrying because on the USSR next turn, they could just coup Pakistan and take you out from there. Okay, so that is the early game objectives of the United States. If you try to go for Lebanon, Egypt, and then ideally later on Libya, if you try to go to Malaysia and then Thailand, or if they flubbed here, go into Pakistan, or if you go into Greece and then Turkey, you're basically vying for control of those regions and doing the best you can to fight against the USSR. As the US, you typically want to be trying to keep the Soviets back and try to make them not get too many points so that the better cards in the later eras can help pull it back towards you. All right, so that's pretty much early objectives for the US. Let's now shift the focus back to the USSR. So you see the US doing this stuff. What does the USSR do in the early game? Well, you pretty much have free reign of the Middle East. You can try to take some battleground countries here. However, some great early game plays can be the following. You could play some operations points as the USSR to place 2 influence into South Korea. And this is a very threatening move because with the Korean War, if it goes off and it goes well, that 1-point flipping will be enough for them to take South Korea. So that's a very good threatening move for them there. Don't spend any of your points into Japan, by the way, because this could just knock you out of there. Other good moves is to spend some influence into Afghanistan to take control and secure that country. Afghanistan is the easiest non-battleground country for the Soviet Union because it's directly accessible. It blocks a connection, which the US could use to score, and it also threatens to go into Pakistan and do shenanigans with the China card in Pakistan as well. So that's a pretty good move. For the Middle East, typically if the US is spraying to Egypt, you could try coupping Egypt instead, or playing Nasser if you have it. But I usually find myself not taking Syria or Iraq during this time. And then finally in Europe, A good first turn play can be to spend 2 ops points to basically break control of West Germany. Because when you do so, you are now threatening to take over France with 3 influence points, and that forces the US to make a tough decision whether to go into France or just let you have it. And if you can take France, then you are threatening domination. Finally, just as the US is fighting for Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey, you should be fighting for that as well. If the US takes Greece, maybe take Turkey and block them off. Doing this threatening move here can also allow you to move towards France and then Spain, Portugal. So great play over there as well. Okay, so that's going to be it for early game moves and how you spend your influence points. I'm now going to go through the early war cards and focus on those very valuable ones and give strategy advice to each player and what you need to do for each of those cards. I'll be talking about the USSR perspective as well as the US perspective. Okay, so first things first, the China card. Oh man, this card is really, really valuable, especially if it's played in Asia, because this card can basically flip games around and cause a losing situation to become a winning situation. The China card is great because it's always 4 points in your pocket, okay? As the USSR, you might be tempted to play this on the first round, and sometimes you have to, but be aware. A good US player will be trying to hold on to these 2 nasty cards, decolonization and destalinisation, and you want them to play these or get rid of them, space them, so you might have a chance to get them later on. If you give them the China card, they could then give it back to you in round 2 and then hold on to these cards more easily, and that can make your life in Africa and South America and Central America more difficult. So don't play this just because you have to play it. If you can hold on to this, all the better. What can you do with the China card? Well, basically, let me demonstrate with an example here. Let's suppose the USSR has this card, and let's suppose Pakistan is controlled at a value of 2. If the USSR were to play this card and put it all in Asia, he would have 5 points. With these 5 points, you can basically spend 2 of the 5 to break control of Pakistan. I'm assuming you have adjacency, by the way. And then you have 3 points left, which you can use to dump them all into Pakistan and then flip the country around to your side. And this can be really devastating because you've not only gained a battleground, you've made the US player lose a battleground, and that can be enough to gain domination. So, China card, very valuable when you're flipping the 2 stability countries like Pakistan as well as Thailand. I'd argue if you could do this in Thailand, all the better, because this card, this place counts for both the Asia scoring as well as the Southeast Asia scoring. So that's a good use for the China card. Okay, other cards to be aware of. If you are the USSR, you should be aware of the Japan Neutral Pact. Do not go for Japan. If you do, you will have a bad time. Just don't, okay? As the US player, if you get this card, you should basically play it for the 4 ops. Because if you just play for the event, you take Japan. And that only needs 3 points. However, if you use the card, you can put 3 of them into Japan and then have 1 more point to, say, take Lebanon, which is a great country. So you should do that. Okay. All right, that is that card. Containment. So Containment is a great US card because it lets them boost all of the cards in their hand by a value of 1 up to a max of 4. The only time the US player might not want to play this is if they have a better headline card, or if all the cards in their hand are kind of close to 4, because if they're already 4, this does nothing for those cards. You can headline this card and then go to town with a great hand. It also defends against blockade, which is a very nasty card that can show up. So yeah, you should try not to just play it for the 3 points, because if you do, you give it to your opponent, potentially, and they can just play it for almost no effect. If you're the USSR and you get this card, just play it on your last action round. It will do almost nothing to your opponent, although they will get to play 1 more card and maybe benefit from that +1 point. Okay, let's see what's next. Nasser. All right, I'm just going in a random order here. So Nasser is great for taking control of Egypt. It's a pretty good headline early on because it allows Egypt to take control, it allows the USSR to take control of Egypt and secure it against the US from spreading in there. It's a very interesting card because later on, Sadat will be in the mid-war, and he can basically knock out Nasser and have the US take control. So mind that. What can typically happen is the US plays, for example, 2 points in Egypt, and then along comes Nasser, knocking this down to, let me move this over here, knocking this down to 1. and then securing it with 2 more points. And then ideally the USSR takes control of Egypt. Later on will come Sadat, which basically knocks all the USSR influence and puts one in Egypt, which means the US will end up with control of Egypt. So as the USSR player, you'll want to be aware of that later on. God, I'm stumbling my words today. Okay, Korean War. I talked about how the USSR player wants to try to get 2 influence in South Korea, and this is the reason why. If you're the USSR, you can just take an operation round to play the 2 points and put them in South Korea and leave this card in the deck, so if the US just tries anything funny, you can just take control of it again later on. As the US player, if this is the situation early on, you actually want to trigger this card first and see the results. If it does not flip towards South Korea, you can then spend the 2 points to really take control and never have to worry about South Korea again. Otherwise, if it does flip, let's suppose this actually goes off and it flips to the USSR, then you can actually take 2 operation points to bring you back to where you were before and keep the situation there as it was before, with the US player up by 1 point. Okay, Suez Crisis. Actually a pretty good early game play, like a turn 1 headline for the USSR, because if we go back to the Middle East, and let's suppose we reset things here, let's say this was like that, this is like that, this was over here. If you play Suez Crisis, turn 1, you can knock out the 1 influence here, and also the influence in the UK, but we don't really care about that. The big thing is, if you use this and then you coup Iran, you can basically knock the US completely out of the Middle East and give them a really hard time of coming back in. So great first turn card if you are committed to coupping Iran, which you should be because it's a really good idea. So, Suez Crisis. By the way, this is also a reason why the US should not play into France early on. You should wait until this card, as well as de Gaulle, comes out before you do so. Blockade. Watch out for this card as the US. It's really bad. Okay? Basically, you should be aware of this card and try to keep a 3 ops card in your hand. If you don't, the USSR can surprise you at the end of the round and knock you completely off West Germany. Now, that said, if you have the 2 nasty cards, decolonization, desalination, in your hand, just give up West Germany. Don't throw these away, because if you do, they'll come back and it'll be more painful later on. It's far better to lose West Germany than to have to give this back to your opponent, potentially. All right? All right. We'll talk about scoring in a bit. Defectors. As the USSR, be aware that your headline might be canceled. So typically, the more powerful cards like destalinization and decolonization, don't play them as headlines because of that risk, okay? Play these during an action round. As the US, you can play it early on, but be aware the USSR might be aware of that. Let's see, what else do we have to... Okay, de Gaulle leads France, another anti-US card for France. Once both this and the other Suez Canal crisis have come out, you can then safely play into France. A good play as the US is if you have this card, you can trigger the event first, giving the USSR 1 influence point, and then dump all 3 of your points directly into France, basically giving you 1 away from control. So that's a great way to deal with this nasty card over here. Okay, a couple of more cards here. CIA created and Fidel. As the USSR, you want to be a little careful about playing Fidel too early, because if you do, you make yourself at risk of CIA created being a bad card in your hand. Okay? The reason why is if you have a DEFCON of 2, right? That means if the USSR plays this card, then the US player can conduct operations and do, as if it's a 1-op card, and they could do a coup in a battleground country. Early on, if you look at the countries outside of the DEFCON 2 area, which is Africa, South America, and Central America, there are no battleground countries. However, if you play Fidel, that gives you Cuba, and Cuba is a battleground country. So if this comes out and then you have this in your hand, and it's DEFCON 2, you're in trouble. So be aware of that interaction over there. Okay, Vietnam revolts. Great way for the USSR to get into Vietnam as well as into Thailand because it's connected. As the US, if you have this in your hand, you want to try and control both Thailand and Laos, Cambodia before you play this card. Additionally, as the US, if you place it in your last action round, it does almost nothing for your opponent. So that's the time to play it. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, Marshall Plan. We've talked about this card. It's a good headline card. As the USSR, if you're worried about this card, a great use of it is to use it to take control of both Greece and Turkey. If you do, you basically block out the US from using this card there because it says non-USSR controlled countries, and it can greatly limit the damage of this card. Okay, let's suppose you're the US and you play this card in an action round. What are your targets? What country should you target in Europe? Let's focus over there. So this should be the order of the countries you target when you are playing this card. Let's suppose we reset things here. First of all, you should put 2 of the 7 influence into the battleground countries of West Germany and Italy. This just overprotects them and makes them safe from any future shenanigans from the USSR players. So we'll put 1 over here and then 1 over here. That's 2 of the 7 so far. Then you should spend your next points into, oh, let's put this back by the way. You should put the next 3 points each into the 2 battleground states I talked about, which is Turkey, Greece, and Spain, Portugal. You now have 2 points left. You can spend a point to take control of Canada, which is almost yours. This is great because it turns on NORAD later on. And finally, the last one depends on the following. Did the card Suez Canal come up yet? If it did not, you know that a typical target will be the UK. So you can kind of protect against this by putting 1 more into UK, making the pain of losing 2 influence there a little bit less, because you can take it back for 1 single influence. If it's already come out and the UK is fine, then instead you can put it in one of the Scandinavian countries, like Benelux or Denmark. And finally, if France is completely, like if the bad cards for France, which is the Suez Crisis, as well as de Gaulle is out, then you can totally put a point there knowing it'll be safe from any Soviet shenanigans. That is the optimal play of the Marshall Plan card. Okay, what else do we have? East European unrest. Yep, socialist governments. These are basically 2 sides of the 2 coins of the same card, focusing on Western Germany. Socialist governments is a great way for the USSR to temporarily knock out the US from a country and then play a sneaky Europe scoring to get domination potentially. East European scoring unrest is not quite as devastating, but it can be great to knock out Yugoslavia and stop them from spreading from there. Let's see. Red Scare, Red Purge is a great first turn play. If you play this, you're crippling your opponent. The key thing is this is a 4 ops card, so playing this means you have much fewer ops, but hopefully, if you play this in the headline phase, your opponent has -6 ops points. And if you use that and take that advantage of that, you can maybe take control of a place and fight your opponent for certain regions and secure victory that way. All right, let us now switch our focus over to scoring cards. All right, so I've already talked about how scoring happens in this game. You have Europe scoring, Asia scoring, and Middle East scoring. Europe scoring is typically not contentious. It's either going to be, I'll shift the focus over here. It's either going to be a situation where it's 3-2 or 2-3. And even if it is like 3-2, it might not be enough to secure domination. Like for example, a typical thing I see is the USSR gets both France and East Germany and then Poland, but the US can easily control the non-battleground countries, thereby negating any chance of scoring domination. So it doesn't typically come up when it comes to Europe. Middle East scoring almost always favors the USSR. And actually, as the US, if you get this in turn 1, you might be tempted to play this as your headline for turn 1, unless you have the Marshall Plan, and just get it out of the way. Because at the beginning of the game, it's 0 points for either player. And yep, just get it out of the way so that you don't have to worry about losing points because of this card. Asia scoring is valuable, okay? And really, because Asia is such a very high scoring region, you kind of want to hold on to this and see which way it's going to swing. If it doesn't look like it's going your way, you can play it early and negate the loss. But if you have this, you should really try to fight for the easy battleground countries and make plays for them. Okay, Asia scoring is probably one of the most highest scoring cards of the game if it goes domination your way, because you can see it up to 3 times in the game. So do invest, and if it's not going your way, you can try using that China card trick I showed you to take control of a region afterwards. Okay, and that is going to be the early war. We've run through a couple of cards. There's still many more to go, but if you're playing this for the first time, I've pointed out those really tricky cards: destalination, decolonization. Be aware of those. Oh, I guess I should talk about one last thing. Okay, USSR. You get these cards. What do you do with them? Rule number 1, never play these as the headline, because if you do, you are just asking to be defectored by the US. And if you are, you can say goodbye to one of your power cards and goodbye to an easy game. Okay? Yes, never play these as the headline unless this has already been played, in which case it's a safe play. Number 2, don't play this early. Okay? It's tempting to play this on the first turn, but if you do, the US can just easily coup you out of those places. Once the DEFCON's at around 2 or so, then you can safely play this card, knowing the US can't retaliate. Same thing for desalinization. Additionally, desalinization is a bit tricky early on because in the early game, there's not that much influence for the USSR to use. However, after a couple of coups, if they went really well, you'll have some spare influence lying around which you can use to spread this around. If you're really lucky and you have both of these in your hand as the USSR, how do you play this out? Well, decolonization can be used to get you into both Africa and Southeast Asia. If you have decolonization, consider putting your points in Thailand, Angola, and Nigeria, and also Algeria if you don't have control of France. Okay? Nigeria is good because it is completely isolated from any other battleground countries. Angola is great because it blocks the US, as well as gives you access to Zaire. And Algeria is great because early on, if there's no influence in France, it gives you connection directly to France, so you can take control of it and threaten it another way. Desalinization is interesting, and it depends on what has been going on. If you have decolonization, actually, let's start with if you don't have decolonization, you can use this as a pseudo-decolonization to get yourself into Africa and Asia, and possibly also South America. If, however, you already have these regions under your control, the best play to use with this card is to basically grab 4 influence from somewhere. Let's say we take it from Pakistan here. Let's say we'll take the singletons. And then you just put 1 in each battleground country in South America. This does a couple of things. Number 1, it stops the US from just coupping you in one place and knocking you out. Because if he coups you here, you could just spread out somewhere else, or coup him right back. Additionally, it makes realigning very hard because, you know, he has to do 4 attempts, and it's really hard to win if you're at a +1. From here, you can easily spread out and guarantee control unless the US finds a powerful card later on. So that's going to be it for the early war. We're going to take a quick break over here and come back with mid-war strategies for new players. I'm sweating bullets here.